Happy Monday. Welcome to the briefing room. Coming to you from the Washington Bureau of ABC News. I'm John Santucci. We have a busy week in store, and I'm already tired. It's only Monday, though. So 1 hour and 11 minutes. What would you do for 1 hour and 11 minutes? Well, Donald Trump did a cabinet meeting, and it went on and on and on. And that's where we're going to start. Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, who was in that room for 1 hour and 11 minutes. Cecilia, are you still able to stand after all that time?
Well, I'm not going to lie. I had to swap my shoes out. I got the comfy ones on now after that.
The flats always make a difference. All right, so let's dive in. He made a lot of news in there with his cabinet, Cecilia. Your note afterwards, too. So for all that time, the president talking about a wide range of topics. Let's start with the G7. The president announcing over the weekend that he's reversing his decision not to host the G7 at his Doral complex. Here's what he said in the cabinet room.
But the Democrats went crazy, even though I would have done it free, saved the country a lot of money. Then they say, oh, but you'll get promotion. Who cares? You don't think I get enough promotion? I get more promotion than any human being that's ever lived. But I was willing to do this for free. And it would have been the greatest G7 ever. I don't think you people with this phony emoluments clause, and by the way, I would say that it's cost me anywhere from $2 to $5 billion to be president, and that's okay.
This is one of the fastest reversals we have ever seen Donald Trump do, Cecilia.
Absolutely. And I don't know, I thought maybe we'd see a little bit of backtracking in the cabinet spree today, but not at all. He's actually sticking to his guns on this one. Look, he came under fire, and the president is spinning this as this was an undoing that he's blaming on the Democrats, that he is blaming on the media. But the reality is, it was the Republicans who really, I think, got his attention on that. He faced headlines this weekend, the president did, that said the Republicans were not happy with Syria. They were not happy with his decision to award himself essentially the contract at to take the G7 to his resort there in Florida. And that is just compounding one thing on top of the next for him right now. You heard the headlines out of those statements, though, John. He said that he doesn't need any self-promotion. He's sticking to his guns, that he says he won't make a profit if the G7 were to have gone to Doral. He's calling pretty, to me, shocking, the emoluments clause, which essentially regulates conflict of interest for government employees. He's calling it phony, and he says that he's losing money, $2 to $5 billion being president of the United States. But he's saying now that would have been the best G7 ever had it been held at Doral, but they're now looking at new places, potentially Camp David. But you also heard Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff of that press conference here last week, John, say that Camp David was a disaster during the last summit that they had there. So mixed messages on that front today. Yeah,
definitely from that rough press conference Mick Mulvaney had last week. And we should also fact check the president. He can say he's losing money, but as you and I both know, his property just up the street, the Trump Hotel, has been raking in millions and millions of dollars since he has taken the oath of office. Meantime, the other headline in there, Cecilia, is obviously the news overnight, first reported by the New York Times, that he's considering changing course as it relates to Syria. But he made an eyebrow-raising comment during that cabinet meeting. Let's take a listen to what the president said.
So far, there hasn't been one drop of blood shed during this whole period by an American soldier. Nobody was killed. Nobody cut their finger. There's been nothing.
Cecilia, you want to take that one?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what time frame he's talking about, if he's talking about potentially since this so-called ceasefire happened, but the reality is there have been 7 deaths to our count of a U.S. military involved in Syria there, so not a drop of blood, I think, is inaccurate to say if you're looking at the big picture there. But there seems to be also some question about what is happening with the troops in Syria. There were reports that you mentioned that there will potentially leave a few hundred U.S. troops in Syria, despite the president saying that he's withdrawing all of the troops there. That came from the defense secretary today, but the president just now in this cabinet spray said that he didn't think it was necessary to leave some troop there in Syria. So again, we're seeing some mixed messaging on that front. He also said that these troops would be coming home, but the reality is, John, we know that many of them, if not almost all of them, are being sent to Iraq. So there's no plan to bring them home, at least in the immediate future.
And Cecilia, just before I let you go, you were in there for the cabinet meeting as part of the White House press pool. That is a rotating cast of White House reporters that go in, one representing print, one representing television and broadcast outlets. That's obviously was your role today. Just as we continue to follow the president and his ever-evolving mood as he is dealing with this growing impeachment inquiry, what stood out from you from that 1 hour and 11-minute rant he had?
I think it was really telling what we saw happen in that period of time inside that cabinet room today. We are talking about a president who is right now facing an impeachment inquiry, who is facing criticism among the ranks of his own party for his troop withdrawal in Syria, for his Doral decision, the G7 decision in Doral. He is under fire, and we are seeing him kind of in this spray today, backed into a corner. I think the quote that summed it up for me today, John, was when the president said, quote, "The president of the United States should be allowed to run the country, not have to focus on this kind of crap." He's annoyed. He's ticked off. He spoke for 20 minutes without any interruptions, 20 minutes straight of basically a monologue, starting with everything from Hillary Clinton to crowd sizes. So he's trying to spin this as pay attention to my economy, pay attention to the good things I'm doing. And I think he's very frustrated that those things are not getting very much attention in the middle of all of these controversies hanging over this White House right now.
Cecilia Vega at the White House. Thank you, Cecilia. We appreciate it. And as Cecilia mentioned, there's a lot of controversies hanging over the White House right now. Obviously, it is the growing impeachment inquiry. Here are the three things that we think you need to pay attention to this week as we see another busy week happening in Washington. Number one, key depositions up on Capitol Hill. We are about to enter our third week of closed-door depositions led by House Democrats looking into the growing impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Number two, subpoenas. We have seen a growing number of subpoenas being handed out to members of the Trump administration, other agencies, close allies of the president. So far, all of those subpoenas have been rebuffed. We need to see if that changes. We do not expect it will, but we'll keep an eye on it. Lastly, the president's team. There has been an ongoing internal battle for control of the impeachment probe. Who's in command of it? Who's not? The battle over Mick Mulvaney versus the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, versus Jared Kushner, the president's senior advisor, who just happens to be his son-in-law. Let's talk more about impeachment right now, along with my colleague, Catherine Falders. So, Catherine, let's go back through that graphic, because one of the things we were talking about are the depositions. Yeah. There have been so many that have happened already. We are nearing up to 24 officials that have either already gone up or been called to go up. The key one, though, for this week is tomorrow.
Yeah, this is Bill Taylor. He's a former diplomat to Ukraine. He was really involved in those text messages that we saw revealed where there were about 3 diplomats communicating, saying they were worried about the main thing we've really been talking about here, the quid pro quo. There was something brought up in the text messages, you see them up there, but something brought up in the text messages that said that he would be worried if the administration were to withhold aid to Ukraine in exchange for investigation. So I think what we would hear a lot from him tomorrow is going to specifically focus on that aid, the timeline of that, what exactly really happened, and then of course, the involvement of the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and we might learn about more of his involvement in this.
And we mentioned also about the role of the White House right now, the changing dynamics of who's in command at this point in time. It does feel like they are trying to get things underway. They had a failure last week in trying to bring on former South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy to join their legal team. What do we know right now about efforts to expand the team that has to deal with this impeachment probe?
Yeah, so the Trey Gowdy thing, as you and I reported on, obviously fell through for various reasons. But I think there's a little bit of a debate internally about who they need, what they need. Do they need more people on the inside, more lawyers on the inside? Do they need more lawyers on the outside? I think you and I both know that there is an acknowledgement that they probably do need more legal advisors or lawyers working internally. But look, I think there's still a little bit of a push and pull between, as you mentioned, the White House counsel's office and Mick Mulvaney. Some are frustrated that the lawyers in the White House are looking at this purely from a legal perspective and not a political perspective. So I think we'll see some more movement on that in the next week or two. They're meeting on it today, so we'll see if anything comes from that.
Catherine Falders keeping an eye on it all. Thank you, Catherine. We appreciate it. We're going to switch gears. Let's go overseas. And we mentioned President Trump talking in the cabinet meeting about Syria, the growing crisis there. Now reversing course, going to leave some troops on the ground there. Final numbers still being figured out. I want to go to my colleague, ABC's James Longman, who's on the ground.
Well, I think there's been some confusion about this because what was said was that the idea was to keep a couple of hundred troops in the region in order to kind of keep an eye on the oil. Now, in this part of Syria that we're talking about, the majority of the oil actually is much further south. So what is the suggestion here? That US troops would remain close to an oil field was actually on territory which the Syrian regime would claim, and having essentially abandoned the Kurds, that's how the Kurds would see it, or do see it at the moment, are the Americans therefore then asking the Kurds to come with them south to protect oil fields? The suggestion was that these oil fields are a source of income and revenue for extremist groups like ISIS, so that's a legitimate reason to want to protect them. But what authority would the Americans have to be able to continue doing that if they weren't continuing to support the Kurds further north? As for this ceasefire, well, I think it's been a ceasefire really in name only. It's the fighting really has continued over the last few days, although there has been signs of some success because the SDF have decided to withdraw. They announced yesterday they are withdrawing or have withdrawn from Ras Al Ain, that strategically important town. So I think that in Washington will be read as a success of sorts. But John, we're heading for a much bigger issue here because that US-Turkey brokered agreement that was made obviously between Mike Pence and the team and President Erdogan, it stipulated that the Kurds would withdraw from this area of northern Syria. But exactly where they would be withdrawing from, there is a big difference between what Turkey expects and what the Kurds expect. And the Kurdish commander told us they're only withdrawing from Ras Al Ain and a couple of other strategic places. They're not going to withdraw from this 200-plus mile stretch across northern Syria. And because of that, we're seeing real concern. The ceasefire is due to end tomorrow. Civilians are on the move because they know that the hostilities could kick up again.
James Longman, thank you, sir. Let's bring in our senior Pentagon reporter, Louis Martinez, for the quick check on what's happening right now on the ground. Louis, happy Monday. Thanks for coming in with us. So obviously that New York Times report overnight that the president is considering leaving some troops on the ground, Defense Secretary Mark Esper confirming that is one of the ideas currently on the table. What do we know right now, Louis?
What we know right now, John, is that there is no proposal that has been presented to President Trump right now about this. This is something that's being talked about internally here at the Pentagon. The idea of keeping maybe several hundred U.S. troops in those oil fields that James was talking about that are along the eastern area there of Syria, actually way down in the middle Euphrates River Valley, not even close to the border area that we're talking about when it comes to the Turkish and the Syrian Kurds fighting way up to the north. But just an idea that's being pushed out there, but it sounds like it's an idea, as we've heard just now from Cecilia and from James, that something that President Trump supports because he's been tweeting about it. And he talked about it at this cabinet meeting, and so it's possible that this could be something that he puts forward. Another thing to think about is that he's also decided to keep, last week he announced that he's keeping maybe 200 troops or so down along this one isolated base down along the border with Jordan and Iraq. This is because it's along a main roadway between east and west, where Iran has been known to traffic weapons towards extremists in southern Syria that could target Israel, and that's why the president acknowledged today that he is talking to Israel and to Jordan, and at their request, he's keeping those forces there. So he looks like he's open to the possibility of keeping troops. So let's talk about this for a little bit. How many is he going to keep? Because if the idea was to get rid of 1,000 U.S. troops from inside Syria, if we do this piecemeal, we're slowly adding up to close to 400 now.
Louis, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the comments he made in the cabinet meeting earlier that I spoke with Cecilia about, to say that no American soldiers have died, or I think the line was cut a finger over in Syria. Obviously, Cecilia is right. We do have to know, we don't know what time frame he's exactly speaking of, but on a whole, that is simply not true.
That's correct. As Cecilia mentioned, there have been 7 U.S. military fatalities ever since the U.S. began military operations in October 2015 inside Syria. The largest deadly event occurred earlier this year in mid-January when we had 4 Americans that died, 2 civilians. This was a bomb attack launched by ISIS inside a cafe inside Manbij. Manbij, again, in the news this week because this is the place where U.S. troops pulled out and the Russians and the Syrians moved in. Yeah, as far as it goes, we need to know the context. And as far as this ongoing operation right now, it appears that he may be right. I went over and asked a spokesman here what he had heard about this. He said he referred me to the White House, which is expected. But we would have heard if there had been some incidents. We've seen some video that you're seeing right now, these American troops that were leaving this northern town of Qamishli. They were troops that were escorting a semi-trucks carrying equipment out of Syria into Iraq. And they were receiving potatoes that were thrown at them, being thrown at them by Kurdish people who are upset that the U.S. has abandoned them, is the term that we've heard over the last week or so. And so, of course, the dissatisfaction there. But then at the same time, you're also seeing this other images while I've been talking that showed the deliberate withdrawal of the large numbers of U.S. forces from a large military base inside Syria, and that is proceeding according to plan in a phased withdrawal, most of them from the west leaving first, either by plane or by ground convoy, and then others, you see them packing there right now, their materials. Others will be moving in the eastern part. We had anticipated they were all going to move from the eastern part into Iraq, but right now it seems like they're just going to maybe stay a little longer if the president decides that that's actually what's going to happen, is particularly when it comes to those oil fields.
We'll keep an eye on it. ABC's Louis Martinez over at the Pentagon. Thank you, Louis. You can keep track of Louis and the team's all their great reporting up online right now at abcnews.com. There was something else that was supposed to happen today. One of the first opioid trials was supposed to get started out in Ohio. It did not, and that is because the parties on both sides reached a settlement, $200 million settlement. That is not a small amount of money. And now what happens to other cases that are pending? I want to bring in Dr. Kathleen Brady. She is the Vice President of Research at the University of South Carolina. Doctor, great to have you with us on this Monday. We appreciate it. Obviously, this would have been a historic case had it gone forward. But you wrote an op-ed about now that we saw the settlement from this $200 million, what do you hope that money can get used for?
Well, my hope is that unlike that historic tobacco settlement back in 1998, that this money is really used to support treatment and to support research about new treatments. Now, the money really does need to be focused on the opioid epidemic. And unfortunately, with the historic tobacco settlement, much of that money went to just covering state budget deficits and other pet projects. Only about 3% was used in ways that were directly impacting tobacco use and prevention. So I hope that sufficient restrictions can be put on this money so that it really is dedicated to both treating people and compensating people who have been impacted by the opioid epidemic, but also research into new treatment. I mean, we have good treatments, but our treatments can be better. And we have a treatment system that's really somewhat broken. Addiction services are often segmented and sort of taken out of general medical care. And we know that people with addictions have lots of mental and physical problems. So we really need integrated care. So the monies really need to be used to reshape and reform our treatment system and to researching new treatments. There's all kinds of exciting developments in neuroscience these days, new pathways that have been elucidated that might help us in treating addictions and in treating chronic pain, which is really one of the main ways this epidemic started. And so, again, research and evidence-based treatment. And I hope we can really see some restriction of the use of these funds so that they're directed towards solving the problem.
And Dr. Brady, before I let you go, as you were speaking, we were putting up some of the shocking numbers on screen for our audience. Obviously, where Ohio, where this case was set to begin today, they have the second highest number of deaths as reported in 2017 related to opioids. Give us the number that keeps you up at night in your research that you think Americans should be aware about.
There are so many numbers, but really just the estimate that we lose 130 people a day to opioid overdose, somewhere between 115 and 130, depending on which year we're looking at, that we've lost 400,000 lives in the last 2 decades, and that actually overdose death overtook traffic accidents as the #1 cause of accidental deaths last year. Those are the kind of numbers that really keep me up at night.
It's numbers that we just shouldn't have to talk about. Dr. Brady, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Switching gears here in the briefing room. So tomorrow up on Capitol Hill, in addition to everything else they've got going on, there's going to be members of Congress talking about growing support for a new act. It's called the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This is obviously something that would affect many Americans, and it deals with rights regarding pregnant women at the workplace and job security and how that relates to everybody's individual needs. I want to bring in a woman that's going to be up on Capitol Hill testifying tomorrow, Michelle Durham. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
But you know, your story here, which I want to tell a little bit of the audience about, you had your dream job.
Yes.
And you had gotten pregnant at 22. You were hoping to keep that job.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you?
I was working as an EMT, and at 16 weeks, I found out I was pregnant. I'd had my first appointment, and the doctor put me on a regular weight restriction of 50 pounds. Standard across the board, no big deal. Well, our stretchers weigh 100 pounds without a patient on them. So I had contacted my supervisor and told him I was of my weight restriction, and we both agreed, of course, I couldn't work on the truck. It wouldn't be healthy for me to be lifting twice the weight restriction without anybody even on the stretcher. And so I discussed with him about moving to the light duty position that they offered for either for the workman's comp or moving to a dispatch position.
Right.
And he told me he would talk to HR and get back to me. And I was told that I wasn't allowed to move to dispatch. There was training involved that apparently would take too long according to them and everything going on. And that the light duty positions were only for those on workman's comp that had been injured on the job.
So now you tried to work with a system that obviously worked against you. And when you ended up taking leave, that was unpaid leave. And my understanding is that you tried to find a position during that time.
Actually, I hadn't taken the leave at all.
You didn't take, okay.
This was before they sent me the paperwork later saying that I was actually only allowed to take a 90-day unpaid medical leave.
Okay.
Which would only actually put me through half of the period that I would be on this restriction anyway. I still had 6 months left to go.
Right.
And they actually, in the paperwork, said that not only was I not eligible to try and apply for unemployment benefits or look for another job during this time, but at the end of the 90 days, they got to choose whether or not I came back to work.
Wow. That obviously, being pregnant is something that, you know, is in and of itself scary. My wife's pregnant right now, so I know she's going through a lot of changes herself. But to have to worry about your job in the process thereof, that had to be overwhelmingly daunting.
It was very overwhelming. It was a very upsetting time. It's hard to actually look back at my pregnancy and see the happy moments because I spent so long fighting this. I mean, when I went and talked to Heather, the whole idea was that this was a misunderstanding. She even said, this has got to be a misunderstanding. Let's just send them a letter.
Right.
And that's where we started. We sent a letter just to see if we could work something out and just get my job back.
Now, your case caught the attention of the ACLU, who's been working with you. You're going to go up tomorrow, as I said, to speak to members of Congress.
Yes.
What do you want them to hear from you?
I want them to hear how hard it is to have to prove that there are positions that you could have worked. Because the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act actually puts it on the employer to prove that it's an undue burden to give a pregnant worker a job while they're pregnant. I mean, the people that were on these workman's comp jobs had weight restrictions at my level or lower. Some of them could only lift 25 pounds. But I wasn't allowed to take that position.
And the hardest thing for many people is that obviously you want to keep your job. It's hard to speak out like you're doing now for women that are in this position they find themselves at this moment.
Yes. I don't want anybody else to go through what I've went through. That's been my whole stand on this. I don't want anybody to have to deal with this because it was a nightmare the moment I realized that I didn't have a job. that I was pregnant and I was going to have to find a way to not only pay the bills I had at home like everybody else, but to be able to get stuff for my son, to get clothes and a bed and do all the happy things that you guys think about, you know, picking out stuff for your nursery. I got lucky in the fact that my family and my friends were really supportive, and I got a lot of hand-me-downs and gifts and things like that to help out with it. But there are women out there that don't have that kind of a support system.
They definitely don't. Your son's doing well, though?
Oh, yes, he's amazing. He's 3 and just a ball of energy all the time.
Good. Well, Michelle, we wish you good luck tomorrow. You'll be up there on Capitol Hill bright and early?
Yes.
All right, go give it to him. Thanks so much for your time. Before we leave you today, there is one other case that we've been paying attention to, and that involves Roger Stone. You might remember him. He was a long ally of the president. In part of one of the depositions that friends of his gave, they talked about a scene from The Godfather Part 2. Take a look at this.
Did you serve under capo regime Peter Clemenza, under Vito Corleone, also known as the Godfather?
I never knew no Godfather. I got my own family, Senator.
Mr. Pentangeli, you are contradicting a sworn statement you've previously made to me and signed. I ask you again, sir, here and now under oath, were you at any time a member of a crime organization headed by Michael Corleone?
I don't know nothing about that. Oh. I was in the olive oil business with his father, but that was a long time ago, that's all.
We have a sworn affidavit.
Okay, so why that movie clip's important right now? Well, lawyers of the Department of Justice actually wanted to show that clip in the trial because that was something Stone talked about, lying to Congress. Fortunately for Mr. Stone, one little victory for him. The judge denied that request by the Department of Justice, so they cannot show anything from The Godfather Part 2 in his trial, which is set to begin later this fall. I'm just going to say it, Godfather Part 1, much better, but that's my opinion. Anyway, that's going to do it for us on this Monday. Make sure to download the ABC News app for any news anytime. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm John Santucci in Washington. You are watching ABC News.